War does not whisper, it roars. And once I was its roar given form, the sword drawn by history, the will of America made flesh. They called me unstoppable, unbreakable, the man who could carve victory from chaos itself. Perhaps they were right. But what they never understood was that I did not seek war for glory. I sought it because peace never knew what to do with men like me. And there is a line in war, a boundary drawn in the souls of men that even victory cannot justify crossing. I learned this not from defeat, but from the quiet, disappointed voice of the only man I ever called my superior. I learned it when I went too far, even for Eisenhower. The year was 1943. Sicily, the ancient crucible of empires, burned beneath the Mediterranean sun. The air was thick with dust and the dense, sweet smell of rotting fruit from shattered orchards, mixing with the sharper scent of cordite and decay. The ground itself seemed to breathe with the corpses buried beneath it, a vast, unmarked grave from centuries of conquest. My army, my magnificent, blood-soaked Seventh, had driven the enemy from their strongholds with the fury of the Old Testament. I could smell victory in the wind, sharp and metallic like blood on iron. It was a smell I knew better than my own skin. From the ridges above Pulama, I watched the convoys crawl like ants through the valleys. Men stumbled forward, half dead from exhaustion, their uniforms stained with sweat and earth. Yet still they marched. They did not march for flag or country in that moment. They marched because I demanded they believe that suffering was sacred, that pain was proof of worth. And I, their general, was the priest of that cruel faith. The papers back home called me a genius. The British called me reckless, a dangerous gambler. My men called me old blood and guts. I told them, you give your blood and I'll give the guts. They laughed, as soldiers do when the truth is too heavy to bear. But I meant it. Every word, every sacrifice was a brick in the monument we were building to victory. At night, the guns fell silent and only the wind spoke, moving through the shattered olive groves like the breath of the dead. That's when the doubts began to stir, not as thoughts but as ghosts in the stillness. Victory in Sicily had come quickly, too cleanly for my taste, and I found myself restless, caged by the very success I had wrought. Eisenhower's orders were clear: consolidate, prepare for the next push into Italy. But I was not built for waiting. Waiting was rot. Waiting was cowardice disguised as patience. My engine was built for one fuel: momentum. Without it, I began to sputter and choke on my own fire. So I visited the hospitals, the aid stations, the tents where broken men tried to remember why they had once been whole. I told myself it was duty, to see the cost, to remind them who they were, to reignite the spark of discipline with my presence. But deep down I was searching for something else, something I couldn't name then, though I know it now. I was looking for a reflection, for proof that I was still human beneath the medals and the myth. Each day I walked among the wounded, my boots echoing on the hard-packed earth, their eyes following me like those of sinners awaiting judgment. Some smiled through the pain, a flash of white in grimy faces. Others looked away, ashamed of their broken bodies. And in that sea of bandaged faces, I began to see my own, fractured, unsteady, lost behind the mask of command. Eisenhower's words echoed from a letter he'd sent weeks before. Remember, George, these men are not machines. They have breaking points. I'd smiled at that once, a condescending twist of the lips for a commander who thought like a politician. But as I stood among the cots, the smell of iodine and infection thick in my throat, I realized I no longer knew where the man ended and the machine began. In them or in me. Discipline, honor, fear. They were my holy trinity, my creed, my curse. And soon that creed would demand blood, not from the enemy, but from my own. The summer sun sank into the hills that evening, its dying light turning the sky the color of dried rust. I remember the silence before the storm, the stillness of a battlefield between breaths. Something in the air had changed. I did not yet know that within days I would cross a line not even war could forgive. That before the campaign was done, I would face not the Germans, but the quiet, implacable judgment of Dwight David Eisenhower, and find it more terrifying than any artillery barrage. Because even for a man like me, a man built for battle, there comes a moment when you realize some lines, once crossed, can never be retreated from. The hospital in Pulama was not a place of healing. It was a monument to pain. A sprawl of olive green tents stretched across the dusty outskirts of the city, where the stench of sweat, gangrene, and rotting linen hung thick enough to taste. The air hummed with flies, a low, constant drone that was worse than silence. The moans of men too broken to sleep mingled with the mechanical cough of generators, and the muted weeping of nurses who'd seen too much, their compassion worn down to a numb, professional efficiency. When I arrived, the sun was bleeding into the horizon, a red wound spilling across the sea. My jeep stopped at the edge of the camp, and for a moment I simply watched. Orderlies moved like ghosts, carrying stretchers, whispering to one another, afraid to speak above a certain tone. War had taught them reverence for silence. Even agony had its own etiquette. I stepped out, boots sinking into the fine, pale dirt, and the men who could still move saluted weakly. I returned each one, my hand a sharp crack against my helmet. They expected fire, thunder, the voice of command, but I had none to give that evening. I was tired, not in the flesh, but in the soul. A deep, grinding fatigue that no sleep could touch. As I walked between the rows of cots, I studied their faces. Some stared blankly at the canvas ceiling, lips moving in silent prayer or meaningless repetition. Others lay still, their bodies trembling with fever. A few smiled, brave boys pretending they were whole. I nodded, offered words of iron dressed as comfort. "Stay strong, soldier. You'll be back with your unit soon." The words felt like stones in my mouth. Then I entered the tent, the one I would remember until the end of my days. It was smaller than the rest, hotter, heavier. The air barely moved, stagnant with the smell of fear. Inside, 2 nurses stood near the flap, their eyes flicking between me and a figure lying on the cot near the far wall. A medic straightened to attention when he saw me, his face drawn, his knuckles white around a clipboard. "Sir," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Private Charles H. Cool, no visible wounds. Suffering from exhaustion." Exhaustion, that word. It always scraped against my nerves like sandpaper. I'd buried too many men who hadn't had the luxury of exhaustion. Men blown apart, men drowned in mud, men who had fought until their bodies simply failed. "Get up, soldier," I ordered, my voice flat, devoid of its usual theatrical boom. He didn't move. He was just a boy, 19, maybe 20. His skin was slick with sweat, pale under the grime. His jaw was slack, and his eyes, when they finally focused on me, held a terror so pure it was almost animal. "Sir, I can't," he stammered. A tear cut a clean track through the dust on his cheek. "I'm afraid to go back. The shells, they won't stop in my head. I can't." The words dissolved into heaving sobs that shook his thin frame. The nurses froze. The medic swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. And something inside me, something cold, ancient, and merciless, took hold. In that instant, I wasn't in Palermo anymore. I was in the Musargan in the mud of 1918. I was in the deserts of North Africa, watching men cut in half by machine gun fire and still crawling forward, their guts trailing behind them. I saw soldiers dragging themselves through hell, through everything but surrender. And here before me was a man unmarked, breathing, trembling, undone by nothing but the fear in his own mind. My voice rose before I could stop it, a volcano of contempt erupting from the cold core. "Cowardice," I spat. The word echoed in the tight space. "You shame your uniform, you shame your comrades, you shame your country, lying here while better men are dying in the dirt for you." Tent was silent except for his ragged, choking sobs. My hand moved, sharp, reflexive, an extension of my rage. The sound of the slap cracked through the air like a rifle shot. It wasn't a hard blow, not physically, but its violence was seismic. He fell back against his thin pillow, stunned, eyes wide with a new kind of shock, tears mixing with dust and the red imprint of my fingers. The nurses gasped. One brought a hand to her mouth. The medic's mouth opened, then closed again, all words stolen. And I, the great General Patton, conqueror of Africa, savior of Sicily, felt nothing. No triumph, no righteous fire. Only a hollow, airless stillness that follows an act too sudden, too fundamental to comprehend. I turned to the medic, my voice now dangerously calm. "Put that man back on the line. I won't have cowards in my hospitals. He will face the enemy or face a court-martial." Outside, the sun had vanished. The sky had turned the color of lead, and the first evening wind carried the smell of rain and distant decay. I remember the way it brushed my face, cool, indifferent. As I stepped back into the dying light, the silence that followed me through the camp was not the silence of respect. It was fear. A new kind of fear. Even the wounded seemed to draw their breath as I passed, as if they feared my eyes might find them wanting, my hand might fall on them next. That night I wrote in my journal, the pen digging into the paper. Fear is the enemy of discipline, and I will destroy the enemy wherever I find it. But even as I wrote, the words rang hollow, the ink seeming to bleed uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the tents, thunder rolled, slow, distant, inevitable. The storm was coming. I just didn't yet know its name was Eisenhower. It took less than a day for the story to spread. In every camp, from the beaches of Gela to the dusty roads near Messina, men whispered about what had happened in Palermo. The tale changed with each retelling. Some said I had struck the boy twice, others that I had drawn my pistol, that I had threatened to shoot him myself for cowardice. War breeds rumor faster than it breeds victory. And I, who had built my legend on the fear I instilled in the enemy, found myself devoured by a different kind of fear among my own. I told myself it didn't matter. Soldiers gossip, junior officers grumble. Discipline would hold as it always had. The iron would stay in their spines because I put it there. But something had shifted in the air around me, something subtle and poisonous. When I walked through the ranks now, the men still saluted, but their eyes flicked away too quickly, down to my boots, to the ground, anywhere but my face. They stood straighter, yes, but the respect felt colder, transactional. The fervent, almost worshipful admiration that had once burned in them had turned to a wary, calculating unease. My aides said nothing, though I could feel their silence like a weight pressing down on every briefing, every map session, every late-night strategy meeting. It was a silence that judged. Major Charles Codman, my closest aide, a man of impeccable manners and quiet loyalty, had the courage to hint at it one evening over a glass of bad Sicilian brandy. "Sir," he said, his voice careful, measured, as if disarming a bomb, "some of the men are uneasy about what happened at the hospital. The correspondents are starting to ask questions." "Uneasy?" I snapped, the brandy burning in my throat. "You mean they've gone soft? The army isn't a hospital for cowards, Codman. It's a weapon, and a weapon must be hardened." He tried again, gentle, patient, like a man approaching a wounded animal he still respected. "Sir, the private was suffering from combat fatigue. The doctors—" "Fatigue?" I cut him off, slamming my glass down. "I'm fatigued. Eisenhower's fatigued. The dead are fatigued, Codman, but they don't whimper about it. They don't hide in tents." The words came too fast, too loud. I saw Codman's eyes flicker. Not anger, but something worse, pity. And beneath that, a sliver of fear of me. I dismissed him with a sharp wave, and he left without another word. For the first time in my career, I found myself packing the room long after an argument, my own righteous fury echoing back at me, sounding hollow, unsure of who had been right. But the war allows no pause for reflection. It grinds forward, consuming doubt in the furnace of action. 2 days later, I was inspecting another field hospital near Agrigento. The heat was suffocating, the smell of salt and sweat clinging to everything. The men were restless, wounded, worn thin. I moved through them like a ghost in polished boots, speaking to each in turn, forcing my voice to sound calm, commanding, divine. A performance of normalcy. Then it happened again. Another soldier, older this time, a sergeant with graying temples. Another trembling voice, another plea for mercy I was too proud, too frightened to hear. His eyes darted like a trapped animal. He said he couldn't fight anymore. He said the screams of his squad caught in a mortar barrage wouldn't leave him. I saw weakness, not suffering, betrayal, not terror. And the cold, merciless thing inside me rose again. My hand rose once more. Another slap, another crack in the silence. This time the witnesses were many. A nurse dropped a tray of instruments. A corpsman turned his head away. A lieutenant stared, his mouth agape. And there, In the corner, a war correspondent I recognized, his notebook already in his hand, his eyes wide not with horror but with the cold gleam of a career-making story. I saw the shock ripple through them, the disbelief curdling into disgust. And in that moment, standing over a weeping sergeant, I felt something I had never felt on any battlefield, utterly, completely exposed. The mask had not just slipped, it had been torn off and held up for the world to see. By nightfall, the incident had already reached headquarters. Reports were written, statements signed. The machinery of the army, which had carried my name like a battle cry from Casablanca to Palermo, now began to turn against me with a quiet, bureaucratic inevitability. The same institution that celebrated my victories now documented my disgrace, but I refused to see it that way. Not yet. I told myself I was right, that I was saving the army from the creeping disease of weakness, that I was preserving the warrior's code in a world that was already going soft. I told myself Eisenhower, a soldier himself, would understand the hard necessities of command. Yet when I looked in the mirror that night, the face staring back was not that of a savior. It was older, harsher, the eyes ringed with shadow, the mouth a twisted line of defiance against something unseen, something internal. For the first time, I wondered whether I was still leading men, or if I had simply become a man led by his own legend, a prisoner of the roaring monster I had created. In the quiet hours before dawn, I dreamt not of battles but of a long, green field at West Point. Eisenhower was there, younger, smiling his easy grin. He said nothing, just pointed to a line drawn in the grass. I knew it was the line I had crossed. When I woke, trembling and sweat-soaked, the silence of the Sicilian morning felt like a verdict waiting to be read. The letter arrived not at dawn but mid-morning, a courier in dust-stained khaki handing it to Cudman, who entered my quarters with the careful steps of a pallbearer. The seal of Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, glared up at me from the envelope. The eagle, the shield, the symbol of the very chain of command I had sworn to obey and had so spectacularly tested. I dismissed everyone but Cudman. He stood by the door, stiff as a rifle at inspection, his face a blank page. My hands, these hands that had held the reins of tanks, traced battle lines on maps and yes, had struck my own soldiers, trembled slightly as I broke the seal. The paper was crisp, official. Eisenhower's tone in his precise, typed words was calm, measured, devastatingly paternal. There was no rage, no thunder, no hint of personal vengeance. That made it infinitely worse. It was the voice of disappointed principle, and it was a sound against which my bluster had no defense. "George," it began, a simple start that felt like a death sentence. "Reports have reached me of 2 separate incidents in which you physically struck and verbally abused soldiers under your command who were hospitalized for medical condition, including combat exhaustion. Your actions cannot be justified by the necessities of discipline or the pressures of command. You have violated the trust of the men you lead and the principles of this army. You will immediately make a formal apology to the individuals involved and to the personnel present. You will also prepare a statement of explanation and contrition for distribution to all elements of the 7th Army. Further, you are hereby relieved of field command of the 7th Army, effective upon the arrival of your successor. You will report to me in Algiers at the earliest opportunity." It went on, detailing the administrative steps, but the words blurred. Relieved of command. The phrase echoed in the silent room. The mighty 7th Army, my army, the instrument of my will, no longer answered to me. I had driven it like a spearhead into the heart of the enemy, and now the hand on the spear had been prut off. For a long while I didn't speak. The clock on the wall ticked. A fly buzzed against the window pane. I carefully folded the letter, creasing the edges with a nail, and placed it neatly in the center of my empty desk. "Tell them I'll be ready to answer," I said to Cudman, my voice strangely flat. But that was a lie. I wasn't ready. Not for him, not for the calm, inescapable judgment in those words. The sun was high now, beating down on the canvas, yet a coldness had settled in my bones. My medals, arrayed on a chest in the corner, caught the light and gleamed dully, tinny, meaningless things. Outside, the camp went on with its life. Engines coughed to life, boots crunched in the dirt, sergeants barked orders. The daily rhythm of an army that no longer needed its general to march. I stared out the window toward the tawny hills. The landscape was beautiful in a cruel, timeless way. Golden fields scud by black shell holes, ancient olive trees bent and broken by passing tanks, the sky a pale, oblivious blue. And in that fragile, silent stillness, I realized I had never truly seen Sicily until that moment. It was not a battlefield I had won. It was a graveyard where my career had just been buried. The journey to Algiers was a purgatory. The flight in the rattling C-47, the stares of other officers who knew, the crushing weight of shame that was both hot and cold. I was taken not to a headquarters buzzing with war, but to a quiet villa overlooking the sea. Eisenhower was waiting in a sunlit office, maps of Italy covering the walls, the next war already planned. He stood up when I entered, not with anger, but with a weary sadness that was 1,000 times more terrible. "George," he said, gesturing to a chair, "no general, no old blood and guts, just George." I can explain," I began, the old fire trying to kindle. He held up a hand, not a command but a request for silence. "There's nothing to explain, George. I've read the reports. I've heard from the doctors. I've even seen the photographs one of the correspondents took." He sighed, a long, tired exhalation. "What in God's name were you thinking?" "It was about discipline, I insisted, leaning forward. "You let one man crack and it spreads like a poison. I was hardening the line." "Those men were the line, George," he said, his voice rising for the first time not to a shout but to a sharp, painful clarity. "And you didn't harden it, you broke it. You broke them. And in doing so, you broke the faith. The faith those men have that their commander will care for them, that the army is more than just a machine that grinds them up. That faith is the only thing that keeps an army from becoming a mob. You of all people should know that." I wanted to argue, to roar, to quote Caesar, to talk of the Spartan code. But the words died in my throat. He was looking at me not as a superior to a subordinate. Not even as a friend to a friend who had erred. He was looking at me as a man who had tragically, fundamentally, misunderstood his own duty. It was the most devastating gaze I had ever endured. "The war needs you, George," he continued, his voice dropping back to its steady, plain state cadence. "Your drive, your tactical genius, they're undeniable, but it doesn't need this. I cannot and I will not have a commander who terrorizes his own wounded. The price is too high, not for publicity but for the soul of this army. Do you understand?" I said nothing. I just stared at the intricate pattern in the Persian rug on the floor. "You're out of the 7th, he said, finality ironclad in his tone. "For now, you're out of the war. You will apologize publicly and repeatedly. You will go to every hospital in the Mediterranean theater if I order it, and you will look those men in the eye. And then you will sit. And you will wait. And you will hope to God that I can find a use for you again someday, once the world has forgotten the sight of you striking a crying boy." The sentence was delivered. There was no appeal. I was benched. The star player ejected from the game for unsportsmanlike conduct against his own team. The public penance was a unique and exquisite hell. The photographs, me stiff and grim, shaking the hand of a bewildered private cool who looked more frightened by my apology than he had been by my slap. The speeches, my voice, trained to project to thousands, now grinding out words of contrition to small groups of sullen, disbelieving men. I deeply regret my actions. I lost my sense of proportion. The brave soldier does not fear battle, but the commander must fear losing his humanity. The words tasted like ash. The journalists ate it up, their pencils scratching, their cameras clicking, turning my humiliation into a morality play for the home front. For months, I was a ghost in a general's uniform. I was paraded at press conferences to show the Army's corrective action. I was sent on meaningless tour, a living lesson in what not to do. I watched from the sidelines as others led the charge into Italy, as the war moved on without its most ardent champion. The idleness was a torture worse than any battlefield fear. I was drowning in peace, in reflection, in the deafening silence of my own disgrace. And in that silence, Eisenhower's words echoed incessantly. The soul of the army. I had thought the soul of the army was its fighting spirit, its will to win at any cost. He spoke of a different soul, one of collective trust, of shared sacrifice, of a covenant between the leader and the led. I had violated that covenant. In my obsession with eradicating the fear in one man, I had forgotten the sacred trust that held my own command together. I had not been a priest of a cruel faith. I had been a heretic who betrayed the congregation. The call came months later when the campaign in Normandy was bogged down, when the breakout seemed impossible. Eisenhower needed a battering ram. He needed the roar again. But it was a calculated risk, a leash kept short. The command was smaller. The eyes were on me. The message was clear. The genius was still needed, but the monster must be chained. I took the command with a gratitude that bordered on desperation and a humility I had never known. I fought the rest of the war with one eye on the enemy and one on that invisible line I could never cross again. The roar was still there, but now it had a conscience, a painful, scarred-over reminder in the shape of a young private's face and the sound of a quiet, disappointed voice saying, "George." The war ended. I became a governor, a peacetime administrator, a final, bitter irony for a man who lived for conflict. And on that December morning in 1945, when the truck slammed into my car, when I felt my neck snap and the world narrowed to a ceiling in a Heidelberg hospital room, my thoughts were not of battles won or glory lost. In those 12 final days, paralyzed, the war finally over for me in the most absolute sense. My mind kept returning not to the great charges or the historic triumphs, but to that tent in Sicily and to the office in Algiers. I had spent a lifetime believing the greatest sin was cowardice in the face of the enemy. Eisenhower taught me that there is a greater sin for a commander, cruelty in the face of suffering. One could be corrected by discipline. The other corroded the very foundation of command. I had gone too far, beyond the acceptable brutality of war, into a personal tyranny that even the mission could not excuse. And the only man with the moral authority to stop me, the only man I truly respected, had done so not with fury, but with a sorrow that ultimately saved what was left of my soul. They say I died of my injuries. In a way, that's true. But the man who wore the ivory-handled pistols and shouted for glory died in Sicily in the summer of 1943, struck down by a memo from a friend. What remained, what led the Third Army across Europe, was a different creature, haunted, tempered, and forever mindful of the line that even George S. Patton could not be allowed to cross. For I had gone too far, and Eisenhower, in his infinite, pragmatic wisdom, had drawn the map that showed me the way back. It was the greatest strategic retreat of my life, and the only one that mattered. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed and you are a true history lover, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment to encourage me for making such content. Don't forget to press that bell icon so you will never miss any video about historical wars and battles. See you in the next video.